Viewer discretion is advised. This presentation contains detailed descriptions of real-life events involving military conflict and loss of life, which may be disturbing to some audiences. It was a ghost, sitting silently on a sea of sand, 440 miles from the nearest coast, under the blistering Libyan sun. An American B-24 Liberator, a titan of World War II, discovered by a British oil survey team in 1958. But this wasn't a wreck. It was a time capsule. The plane was almost perfectly preserved, its silver fuselage reflecting the endless sky. The machine guns in its turrets swiveled and clicked into place. The radios, with a little power, crackled back to life. Inside, a thermos still held drinkable coffee. Charts were laid out, flight logs were open, and personal effects were scattered as if the crew had just stepped out for a moment. But they hadn't. The 9-man crew of the Lady Be Good was gone, vanished. There were no bodies at the site, no graves, no parachutes, just an empty bomber, hundreds of miles off course, in the heart of the deadliest desert on Earth. The plane had crash-landed with such precision that one of its engines was still functional 15 years later. How does a 10-ton war machine designed to fly over Europe end up landing itself in the middle of nowhere? And more importantly, what happened to the 9 young Americans who were supposed to be on board? Their disappearance would spark one of the most haunting and enduring mysteries of the Second World War. To find the answer, we have to go back to a time of global conflict, to a dusty airbase on the coast of North Africa. The date is April 4, 1943. The world is at war. In Salik, Libya, the air is thick with the smell of aviation fuel and nervous energy. This is the home of the 376th Bombardment Group, a key cog in the Allied machine tasked with crippling the Axis powers from the south. For one particular crew, the men of the B-24 Liberator, nicknamed the Lady Be Good. This day is different. This is their first combat mission, a trial by fire from which not all crews returned. These weren't grizzled veterans. They were boys barely out of their teens, plucked from towns across America, from Texas, Massachusetts, Washington, and Ohio. They were bound by a shared duty and the thin aluminum skin of their aircraft. Their pilot was First Lieutenant William Hatton, confident, capable, and ready to lead his men into the fight. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Robert Toner, was his right hand, the second set of eyes and ears in the chaotic cockpit. Then there was the navigator, Second Lieutenant D.P. Hayes, the man whose calculations with a compass and a map were the only thing separating them from friendly territory in the vast, empty expanse of the Mediterranean Sea or the Sahara Desert. The bombardier, Second Lieutenant John Waravka, held the fate of their mission in his hands, his job to deliver their payload with pinpoint accuracy. The rest of the crew were the enlisted men, the backbone of the operation. Technical Sergeant Harold Ripslinger, the flight engineer. Staff Sergeants Robert Lamott and Guy Shelley, the gunners who would defend them from enemy fighters. And Sergeants Vernon Moore and Samuel Adams, the radio operator and another gunner, their eyes constantly scanning the skies. 9 men, a single crew, their lives now intertwined, entrusted to each other and to their machine. And what a machine it was! The B-24 Liberator was a marvel of American engineering. But it was also a beast. With a wingspan of 110 feet and powered by 4 massive Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp radial engines, it was affectionately called the Flying Coffin by some crews for its tendency to be unforgiving of pilot error. It was faster, could fly farther, and carried a heavier bomb load than the more famous B-17 Flying Fortress. But it was also notoriously difficult to fly, especially at low speeds or with an engine out. For a brand new crew, still learning the quirks and personality of their specific aircraft, every flight was a test. The Lady Be Good, serial number 41 to 24301, was fresh from the factory, just like its crew. It had no battle scars, no history. Its story was about to be written. Their target for that evening was Naples, Italy, a heavily fortified port city, a critical nerve center for the Axis supply lines feeding their war effort in North Africa. The mission was a high-stakes affair. 25 bombers from the 376th were scheduled to take off in 2 waves. The flight plan was a brutal one: fly north over the Mediterranean, brave the infamous flak batteries and Luftwaffe night fighters defending Naples, drop their bombs, and then navigate the long, dark journey back to their base in Libya. For the crew of the Lady Be Good, this was the moment they had trained for, the culmination of months of learning, drilling, and preparing for the realities of aerial combat. They were part of Group B, the second wave, scheduled for a late afternoon takeoff to ensure they would arrive over the target under the cover of darkness. As the briefing concluded, the men made their final preparations. They checked their gear, wrote letters home, letters filled with the bravado and quiet fear of young men heading into the unknown. They walked out onto the hardstand, the North African sun beginning to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. There she sat, the Lady Be Good, fully fueled, loaded with 4,000 pounds of high explosives. The ground crews finished their last-minute checks, giving thumbs up to the airmen as they climbed aboard, each man taking his station. The cockpit, the nose turret, the waist gun positions, the radio room. The pre-flight checklist was a symphony of clicks and switches. Engines 1, 2, 3, and 4 coughed to life, one by one, their propellers slicing through the air, building to a deafening roar that vibrated through the very bones of the men inside. This was it. There was no turning back. At approximately 3 p.m., Lieutenant Hatton's voice would have crackled over the intercom, giving the final confirmation. He would have released the brakes, and the heavy bomber would have begun its slow, lumbering journey down the runway. It gathered speed, the rumbling of the wheels on the tarmac giving way to the sheer force of the engines lifting nearly 60,000 pounds of man and machine into the sky. The Lady Be Good climbed into the afternoon haze, banking to join its formation, its silhouette shrinking as it headed north over the sea. It was the last time anyone at Salak Airfield would ever see them. They were heading for Naples, for a wall of anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters. But the real enemy, the one that would ultimately seal their fate, wasn't waiting for them over Italy. It was the vast, silent, and unforgiving emptiness they were leaving behind them, an ocean of sand that would keep their secret for 15 long years. The 25 bombers of the 376th Bomb Group clawed their way into the sky, one by one, from the dusty runway at Salak. It was 2:30 p.m. on April 4, 1943. Each B-24 Liberator was a 4-engine beast, heavy with fuel and a 4,000-pound payload of high explosives. They were a flying armada, a fist of American air power aimed at the heart of Naples. Among them, tail number 64, was the Lady Be Good. Inside her aluminum skin were 9 men, a cross-section of America pulled from their homes and thrust into the crucible of war. Their pilot, 26-year-old First Lieutenant William Hatton, was on his very first combat mission. Think about that. The immense responsibility of a 10-man crew, a brand new complex bomber, and a flight into the most heavily defended airspace in Europe, all on your first day at the office. Beside him sat co-pilot 2nd Lieutenant Robert Toner, a young man from Rhode Island who, like the others, had written a letter home just the day before, full of the casual confidence of youth. In the glass-nosed cone, navigator John Waravka and bombardier Robert Lamont prepared for their intricate dance of charts, stars, and bomb sights. Behind them, the flight engineer, Staff Sergeant Harold Ripslinger, monitored the 4 Pratt & Whitney engines, his ears tuned to the slightest change in their thunderous chorus. And scattered throughout the fuselage were the gunners, Robert Moore, Guy Shelley, Vernon Moore, and Sergeant Samuel Adams, men who manned the .50 caliber machine guns, their eyes constantly scanning the skies for the deadly whisper of a Messerschmitt fighter. These weren't abstract figures from a history book. They were sons, brothers, and husbands. They had hopes for after the war. They joked, they got scared, they missed home. And as the Lady Be Good lumbered into the air, joining the formation that spiraled upwards into the hazy North African sky, they were a team, trusting their lives to each other and to the machine that held them aloft. But almost immediately, things started to go wrong. The mission briefing had warned of high winds and potential sandstorms, but a forecast is just words on a page. The reality was a churning, blinding wall of sand rising from the desert floor. It was the Khamsin, the notorious desert wind, and it met the bomber formation with a brace of fury. Flying through it was like being sandblasted at 300 miles an hour. The fine, gritty dust worked its way into everything, clogging air filters, scratching plexiglass canopies until they were nearly opaque, and threatening to choke the life out of the engines. The B-24s were flying blind, relying solely on their instruments, tossed about in the turbulent air. Pilots fought to hold their position, knowing that a collision in the middle of this airborne chaos would be catastrophic. For the inexperienced Lieutenant Hatton, it was a baptism by fire. The Lady Be Good was buffeted and shaken, the engines groaning under the strain. One by one, planes began to turn back, their engines failing or the conditions simply becoming too dangerous to continue. The mighty armada was being whittled down not by enemy fighters, but by the sheer indifferent power of the desert itself. The Lady Be Good pressed on, but the sand had taken its toll. They began to fall behind the main formation, their airspeed dropping. The other planes became distant specks, then vanished entirely into the haze. Suddenly they were alone. A single bomber, a tiny, vulnerable island of metal and men, suspended between a hostile sky and an endless sea. The plan was to fly north across the Mediterranean, make a slight turn east, and approach Naples. For Navigator Waravka, the job just got infinitely harder. In a formation, a navigator can cross-check his position with the lead navigator. Alone, he was on his own. His primary tools were dead reckoning, calculating position based on speed, time, and heading, and a device called an automatic direction finder, or ADF. The ADF was supposed to tune into radio beacons, giving a clear line back to a known point like home base. It was the GPS of its day. But over the vast, featureless expanse of the Mediterranean, radio signals could be weak, unreliable, or non-existent. As dusk bled into night, they finally reached the Italian coast. Below them, the city of Naples should have been a blaze of anti-aircraft fire, searchlights frantically sweeping the sky. But there was an eerie silence. The main bomber force had already come and gone. The defenses were either reloading or standing down, confused by the arrival of this single, straggling bomber long after the main raid. Lost, late, and completely alone over a hostile city, Lieutenant Hatton made a decision. Finding the primary target was now impossible. The risk of flying in circles looking for it was too great. He gave the order to jettison the bombs. The 4,000-pound payload fell harmlessly into the Mediterranean, and the Lady Be Good, now significantly lighter, banked into a long, graceful turn. The new heading south. They were going home. And this is where the fatal error, the quiet, invisible mistake that would doom them all, began to unfold. As they flew south, they had a powerful tailwind at their backs. On paper, this was a good thing. It meant a faster trip home, less fuel consumed. But this wind, blowing at over 100 miles per hour, was far stronger than forecasted. It was a silent, powerful hand pushing them forward at a speed their calculations couldn't account for. Navigator Waravka, hunched over his charts in the dim light of the cockpit, was doing the math. He calculated their ground speed based on their airspeed and the expected wind. But the reality was drastically different. They weren't just flying home, they were being hurled home. An hour passed. Then two. They should have been approaching the coast of North Africa. Waravka was likely trying to use his ADF, hoping to pick up the radio beacon from the Benina airbase near Benghazi. He would tune the receiver, listen to the faint crackle and hiss in his headset, waiting for the steady tone that would guide them home. But there was only static. Or worse, maybe the ADF was picking up a stray signal, a ghost from another station feeding him false information. We'll never know for sure. What we do know is that the needle on his instrument was not pointing where it should have been. The pilots, Hatton and Toner, stared out into the inky blackness. They were flying on instruments, trusting the math, trusting the science of navigation. Their altimeter told them they were at a safe height. Their compass told them they were heading south. Their clock told them that land should be appearing any minute. Any minute now, they would see the faint glow of the coast, the familiar lights of their base. It was the single burning hope that every aircrew clung to on the long flight back from a mission. But they crossed the coastline in complete darkness. There were no lights, no beacons, no signs of life. Why? Because they hadn't crossed over the populated, friendly area around Benghazi. The ferocious tailwind had pushed them so far, so fast, that they had completely overshot their intended target. They had flown past their base, past the entire North African coast, and were now flying deep into the interior of the continent. They were flying over the great sand sea of the Libyan desert, one of the most desolate and uninhabited places on the face of the earth. And they had absolutely no idea. In their minds, they were still over the Mediterranean. The lack of lights below? It must be a coastal blackout, a precaution against enemy planes. The faulty ADF signal? A common technical glitch. Every piece of conflicting information was rationalized away, because the alternative was simply unthinkable. They continued flying south, deeper and deeper into the abyss, convinced they were heading north over water. For the 9 men aboard the Lady Be Good, the mission wasn't over. They were on the final leg, tired but relieved, anticipating the welcome sight of a runway and the promise of a warm bed. They believed they were almost home. In reality, they had never been more lost. Flying through the ink-black sky, the 9 men of the Lady Be Good were operating on a fatal assumption. They believed the vast, featureless darkness below them was the Mediterranean Sea. Every calculation, every instinct honed over months of training, told them they were flying south, back towards the North African coast. The problem was, their calculations were wrong. Their instincts were deceiving them. And their most critical piece of equipment, the one thing designed to cut through the darkness and guide them home, was silent. The Automatic Direction Finder, or ADF, was supposed to be their lifeline. It was a radio navigation instrument that could lock onto a signal from their home base and point the way like a compass needle pointing north. But on this crucial return leg, the Lady Be Good's ADF was failing. Whether it was damaged by flak over Naples or simply malfunctioned, we'll never know for sure. But without it, navigator Robert Toner was forced to rely on the ancient art of dead reckoning, calculating their position based on speed, time, and heading. It's a method that requires precision and a little bit of luck. On this night, they had neither. A powerful, unforecasted tailwind was pushing them from behind, dramatically increasing their ground speed. They were flying much faster than they realized. So when their watches told them they should be approaching the coastline, they were already there. At approximately 12:12 a.m., the Lady Be Good, a tiny speck in an enormous sky, crossed over the coast of North Africa. Below them, shrouded in darkness and a swirling sandstorm, were the friendly lights of Benghazi and the runways of their own airfield. They flew directly over their home, and they never saw a thing. Inside the cockpit, the mood would have shifted from weary relief to a nagging confusion. Pilot William Hatton and co-pilot Robert Toner would have been scanning the blackness below, searching for the familiar flare path that marked the runway. But there was nothing, just an endless, impenetrable void. Where was the coast? Where were the lights? Their flight time indicated they should be there. But their eyes told them they were still lost over a black sea. Down on the ground at Benaina Airfield, controllers were also growing concerned. The Lady Be Good was overdue. They knew the bomber was out there somewhere, low on fuel, trying to find its way home through the storm. Standard procedure was to fire signal flares into the air at regular intervals, hoping to guide in any lost aircraft. It's a heart-wrenching image. Men on the ground firing rockets of light into the sky, and men in the air, just a few miles away, staring into that same sky, but seeing nothing but black. They were so close, yet separated by a veil of darkness and bad luck. For 2 agonizing hours, the Lady Be Good flew deeper and deeper south, into the heart of the African continent. The crew, still believing they were over the Mediterranean, thought they had somehow missed the entire landmass of North Africa, and were now heading towards the interior of the continent from the other side. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, but one born of exhaustion and the failure of their instruments. The fuel gauges, which had been a distant concern, were now screaming an urgent warning. The needle was bumping against empty. Desperation finally forced Hatton's hand. He broke the strict radio silence that was meant to protect them from enemy fighters. The enemy was no longer the problem. The vast, empty sky was. He keyed the microphone, his voice cutting through the static-filled airwaves, calling out to anyone who might be listening. QRB, he transmitted in Morse code, asking for his bearing, his direction and distance to the station. A radio operator at Benaina heard the call. The signal was faint, but it was there. He tried to get a fix. He asked the Lady Be Good to fire a flare, to give him a visual confirmation of their location. Inside the bomber, a crewman did as instructed, sending a brief, brilliant starburst of light into the desert night. But on the coast, the tower operator saw nothing. He was scanning the skies to the north over the sea where the plane should have been. The Lady Be Good was now more than 100 miles to the south, looking back at a coastline they couldn't see. The radio operator at Benaina did the only thing he could. Based on the faint signal, he gave them a bearing of 330 degrees. This was a QDM, a magnetic heading they should fly to reach the base. It was their one and only lifeline. A single thread of information in a sea of uncertainty. But in their disoriented and exhausted state, the crew made one final fatal error. They likely misinterpreted the instruction. Perhaps they thought it was a bearing from the base, not to it. Or perhaps in the confusion, they simply flew the reciprocal heading. Instead of turning the bomber around and flying north-northwest towards safety, they continued on their current path, flying south-southeast, 180 degrees in the wrong direction. They were flying away from home. With every passing minute, they were venturing further into one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, the Great Sand Sea of the Libyan Desert. It's a place of endless shifting dunes, some hundreds of feet high, with no water, no shelter, and no life. It is an ocean of sand, and they were flying into its deepest, most remote corner. Soon the inevitable happened. The number 4 engine on the right wing sputtered, coughed, and went silent. Then the number 3. The comforting, deafening roar of the 4 right cyclone engines that had been their constant companion for over 12 hours was beginning to die. One by one, the engines starved of fuel and quit, their propellers windmilling uselessly in the cold night air. The Lady Be Good, now a heavy, unpowered glider, began its slow, inevitable descent. There was no hope of landing the massive bomber in the dark on unknown terrain. The only option left was to jump. Pilot William Hatton gave the final chilling order: bail out. One by one, the 9 young men clipped on their parachutes, moved to the rear escape hatch, and hurled themselves out of the crippled plane and into the terrifying, absolute blackness of the desert night. They tumbled through the freezing air, trusting their lives to a canopy of silk, falling towards a land they couldn't see, a place they never knew existed. Back in the cockpit, the autopilot remained engaged. The Lady Be Good, now empty, a true ghost ship, didn't immediately plummet to the ground. With the weight of its crew and bombs gone, the aircraft's descent slowed. It leveled off, flying on its own for a staggering 16 miles, a silent, pilotless machine sailing through the darkness before its wings finally lost their lift. It gently bellied into a flat, open stretch of gravel plain, skidding for hundreds of yards before coming to a rest, remarkably, almost perfectly intact. But for the 9 men now drifting down under their parachutes, scattered by the wind across miles of barren wilderness, the mission was far from over. A new, more terrifying ordeal was just beginning. They had survived the flight. Now they had to survive the desert. The silence of the freefall was shattered by the snap of silk and the jolt of the harness. One by one, 9 men, suspended between the stars and an ocean of darkness, drifted toward an earth they couldn't see. The wind, which had been their invisible enemy in the air, now became their master, pulling them apart, scattering them like seeds across the immense, unforgiving landscape of the Libyan desert. For First Lieutenant William Hatton, the pilot, the landing was a jarring impact. Sand and rock scraped against him as he tumbled, his parachute dragging him a few feet before deflating. He was alive. The immediate, primal relief was overwhelming. He unbuckled his harness, the metallic clicks echoing in the profound silence. The drone of the Lady Be Good was gone. The world was utterly, unervingly quiet. He was alone. Or was he? In the distance, a point of red light shot into the sky, a desperate, beautiful arc against the ink-black canvas. A flare. Someone else was alive. Someone else was thinking. Hatton fumbled for his own flare gun. He fired. Another red star bloomed in the night. Soon more flares answered. Across the dunes, the survivors were signaling beacons of life in a void of death. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to converge. Figures emerged from the darkness, calling out names, voices strained with adrenaline and relief. Hatton, Toner, Ripperger, Waravka. They stumbled toward each other, a ghostly reunion under the cold desert stars. They did a head count, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 8. 8 men had found each other. One was missing. Sergeant Vernon Moore, the gunner, hadn't seen the bombardier, Sergeant John Adams, since they stood at the open bomb bay doors. No one had. They called his name into the night, but the only answer was the whisper of the wind over the sand. With the core of the crew reunited, a fragile sense of order returned. Lieutenant Hatton, as the commander, took charge. They were soldiers. They were trained for crisis. The first priority was to assess their situation. What did they have? The inventory was terrifyingly short. Between the 8 of them, they had the flight suits on their backs, their standard issue .45 caliber pistols, a few flimsy survival kits, a magnetic compass, and a handful of canteens containing at most half a bottle of water each. They had a few chocolate bars and some chewing gum. That was it. No food to speak of. No shelter. And critically, almost no water. Their second priority was to figure out where on earth they were. This fell to the navigator, Lieutenant Waravka. He, like the rest of the crew, was operating under one critical assumption. They knew their fuel had run out roughly 2 hours after they should have been over their base at Ben Aina. Based on the B-24's cruising speed, they calculated they must have overshot the coast by no more than a few dozen miles. They believed they were relatively close to the Mediterranean Sea. They thought they were just south of the coastal mountain range, a hilly, somewhat more hospitable region. It was a logical conclusion, it was a reasonable deduction, and it was a fatal mistake. The truth, which they could not possibly have known, was that their malfunctioning radio direction finder and the ferocious, unyielding tailwind had pushed them hundreds of miles deeper into the continent than they ever imagined. They weren't a few dozen miles from the coast. They were over 400 miles inland, deep in the heart of the Kalanchio Sand Sea, one of the most arid and desolate places on the planet. They were standing at the edge of a wasteland larger than the state of Texas, a place where summer temperatures could soar past 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and where rain might not fall for decades. The sea they were looking for was not a short hike away. It was a journey of impossible distance, across an environment designed to kill. But in the cold darkness of that April night, they were buoyed by a dangerous optimism. They were airmen, not infantry. Their world was the sky, maps, and instruments. The ground was just something you took off from and landed on. They had no real concept of the scale of the wilderness they now faced. They believed rescue was not only possible, but probable. Search parties would be out looking for them. All they had to do was walk toward civilization. A debate began. Should they stay put and wait for rescue? Or should they try to walk out? Staying put was the standard procedure. But the thought of waiting passively in this alien landscape, with their water dwindling, felt like a death sentence. Walking, on the other hand, was an act of hope. It was taking control. The decision was made. They would walk. But which way? Based on their flawed calculations, the coast, their base, and salvation lay to the north. So north it was. They would walk north, confident that in a day, maybe two, they would hit the coast and be saved. They had survived a crippled bomber, a midnight bailout, and a parachute landing into blackness. Surely they could survive a walk in the desert. Before they set off, they made another critical choice. They decided to leave behind anything that might weigh them down. Parachutes, life rafts, heavy boots. Anything that wasn't essential for walking was discarded. It made sense. Traveling light meant traveling faster. But the life rafts, known as Mae Wests, contained emergency water rations and survival gear. In their haste and their fundamental misunderstanding of their location, they were stripping themselves of the very tools that might have given them a fighting chance. As the first hint of dawn began to gray the eastern horizon, the 8 men stood together, a small, determined band of brothers. They looked north into a landscape that was still shrouded in shadow. They couldn't see the endless waves of sand dunes that stretched for hundreds of miles. They couldn't see the sheer, brutal emptiness that awaited them. All they could see was the direction of hope. Taking a small sip from his canteen, Lieutenant Hatton gave the order. They formed a line and began to walk. Their footsteps were the first marks on the sand, a trail leading away from the unseen wreckage of their plane and, tragically, deeper into the furnace of the Sahara. They were walking with purpose, with discipline, and with the shared belief that they were walking toward life. In reality, every single step was taking them further away from it. The sun was about to rise, and with it, an enemy more relentless and more powerful than any they had ever faced in the war. The desert was waiting. As the first rays of sunlight spilled over the horizon, they didn't bring warmth or hope. They brought a terrifying revelation. There was no sparkling Mediterranean, no green coastline, no sign of human life. There was only sand, an ocean of it, stretching in every direction, silent, flat, and utterly indifferent. The illusion shattered. They hadn't overshot their base by a few miles. They had overshot the entire North African coast. They were deep, terrifyingly deep, inside the great sand sea of the Libyan desert, one of the most inhospitable places on the face of the earth. The realization must have hit them like a physical blow. The 9 men, now 8, were trained to fight a human enemy. They knew how to handle flak, how to dogfight Messerschmitts, how to drop bombs on a target. They had no training for this. Their only weapon was their will to survive, and their only map was a desperate, flawed assumption. North meant safety. Lieutenant Hatton, the pilot and commander, gathered his men. Despite the dawning horror, order and discipline held. They were a military unit, and they would act like one. They took stock of their situation. 8 men, 1 canteen of water, a few morsels of food, and hundreds of miles of desert in front of them. The decision was reaffirmed. They would walk north. They were airmen. In their minds, distance was something you conquered in hours, not days. They couldn't yet comprehend the brutal scale of the land they now had to cross on foot. They set their course by the sun and began to walk. The initial pace was brisk, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate optimism. But the desert began its work immediately. The sun, a pale disk at dawn, quickly became a white-hot furnace in the sky. The temperature climbed past 100 degrees, then 110, then 120. The sand reflected the heat, cooking them from below as the sun baked them from above. There was no shade, no shelter, not a single cloud in the vast empty sky. The single canteen of water became the most precious object in the world. They rationed it with excruciating care. 1 small capful per man per day. It was barely enough to wet their lips, a fleeting moment of relief that only highlighted the agonizing thirst that followed. For 15 years, this is where the story would have ended. 8 men walking into a void, their fate a complete mystery. But we know what happened. We know their thoughts, their fears, their incredible endurance. And we know it because of a small leather-bound book found in a pocket 15 years later. A diary kept by the co-pilot, Lieutenant Robert Toner. His neat, cursive handwriting, chronicling their final days, provides one of the most remarkable and harrowing accounts of survival ever recorded. It is through his eyes, and the notes of another crewman, that we can walk alongside them. The first entry is dated Sunday, April 4th, the day they bailed out. It's factual, almost clinical. Bailed out 2 a.m. in morning. No one badly hurt. 1 canteen of water between us. A piece of a sandwich and a chocolate bar. Started walking NW. That first day, they covered what they estimated to be 20 miles. They were exhausted, thirsty, but still a cohesive unit, still believing they could beat this. Monday, April 5th. Day 2. The diary entry is shorter, more strained. Sun very bad. Started walking NW at 6 a.m. No water. Prayed all day. The landscape never changed. Every dune they crested revealed only more dunes, an endless rolling sea of sand that mocked their progress. Mirages began to play tricks on their minds. Shimmering lakes would appear on the horizon, only to vanish as they drew closer. The psychological toll was becoming as severe as the physical one. Hope was a flickering candle in a hurricane. Tuesday, April 6. Day 3. The water was gone. The single canteen, which they had guarded so jealously, was now just a piece of useless metal. The entry in Toner's diary reflects a growing desperation. Still walking NW, getting weak. Sun very bad. Their bodies were beginning to break down. Their lips were cracked and bleeding. Their tongues were swollen, making it difficult to speak. Their skin was burned raw. Yet they kept each other going. When a man stumbled, 2 others would pick him up. They shared their fears, their memories of home, their fading hopes. They were bound by a shared ordeal, a brotherhood forged in the crucible of the sky, now being tested in the furnace of the desert. By Wednesday, April 7th, day 4, they had covered an unbelievable distance, nearly 70 miles from the crash site. But the desert was winning. Several of the men were at the absolute limit of their endurance. They were suffering from heat stroke, severe dehydration, and delirium. Sergeant Guy Shelley, Sergeant Harold Ripslinger, and Sergeant Vernon Moore could go no further. They were collapsing, unable to keep up the pace. The crew faced a terrible choice, a choice no commander ever wants to make. To stay together meant they would all perish where they stood. To split up offered a sliver of a chance, a 1 in a million shot. The decision was made. The 5 strongest men, Hatton, Toner, Adams, Hayes, and Lamott, would press on. They would travel light and fast, push north, find help, and then come back for the others. The farewell was not one of despair. It was a promise. They left the 3 weaker men with what little they had. There were no tears, only grim-faced resolutions and clasped hands. "We'll be back for you," Hatton promised. It was a promise they fully intended to keep. As the 5 men turned their backs and became small specks on the northern horizon, Sergeant Ripslinger took out his own diary. His entry for that day is haunting. "Shelley, Moore, and myself are staying here. The others are going for help. We are too weak to go. Pray it comes soon." The 3 men sat together in the vast, crushing silence of the desert, watching the horizon, waiting for a rescue that would never come. And 500 miles to the south, sitting perfectly on the sand, was the Lady Be Good, with its full canteens of water, its emergency rations, and a radio that still worked perfectly. They had walked away from their only hope of survival. Now, 5 of them were walking on, deeper into the abyss, carrying the fate of the entire crew on their scorched and blistered shoulders. They were walking on fumes, on sheer will, on a desperate prayer. And the desert watched and waited. The 5 men, Toner, Ripslinger, Moore, Adams, and Lamott, formed a single shuffling line against the horizon. Their compass, a tiny instrument of hope, pointed north. North towards the coast, towards life, towards water. Each step was an act of rebellion against the sun, a grain of sand kicked in the face of death. They were a team. They had a plan. Walk at night, rest during the day. Conserve energy, conserve water, conserve hope. The first few miles were fueled by adrenaline, by the sheer relief of being on the move, of doing something. They were airmen, men of action. Sitting and waiting was a slow poison. Walking at least felt like fighting back. But the desert fights back harder. The days were an inferno. They would find what little shade they could, a meager rock outcropping or the shallow side of a dune, and burrow into the sand like lizards, trying to escape the searing heat that baked the very air they breathed. The silence was absolute, a pressure on the eardrums, broken only by the wind and the pounding of their own blood. At night, the temperature plummeted. The cold was a different kind of enemy, one that leached the warmth from their bones, leaving them shivering and weak. And the stars were a cruel joke. A billion cold, distant diamonds scattered across a black velvet cloth, offering no guidance, no comfort, just a stark reminder of their own insignificance in this vast, empty wasteland. Mirages began to taunt them. Shimmering lakes would appear on the horizon, so real they could almost feel the cool water on their cracked lips. They'd see palm trees, even cities, only to watch them dissolve into heat haze as they drew closer. The desert wasn't just attacking their bodies, it was attacking their minds, twisting their perception of reality, dangling false hope before snatching it away with a cruel laugh. They knew they were hallucinations, but a part of them, the desperate, dying part, wanted to believe. It was a constant, draining battle between logic and primal thirst. And through it all, Lieutenant Toner, the co-pilot, kept his diary. A small, pocket-sized book that would become one of the most haunting documents of human endurance ever written. His neat, precise handwriting chronicles their descent into hell. Sunday, April 5th, the first full day of their trek. Toner writes, "Everyone in good shape. 1 canteen of water is the only thing to drink between us. The rest of the boys are waiting for us. We will find them." The optimism is palpable, the sense of duty clear. They weren't just walking for themselves. They were walking for the 3 men they'd left behind. Monday, April 6th. The reality is setting in. Still walking north. 1 spoonful of water each day. The nights are cold. Getting weak. The confident tone is gone, replaced by a stark, factual account of their decline. A single spoonful of water. Imagine that. The discipline it would take not to gulp down the entire canteen, to ration it drop by drop, while your entire body screams for more. Tuesday, April 7th. The group is fragmenting. The physical toll is becoming unbearable. Still walking north. Getting very weak. Can't get very far. Our 4th day out. Sun is terrible. 2 men, Sergeant Ripslinger and Sergeant Adams, are falling behind. Their bodies are giving out. The group faces an impossible choice. Wait for them and risk everyone perishing from thirst? Or press on, hoping the strongest can find help and send it back? It's a decision no one should ever have to make. In the end, they leave a marker in the sand. A simple arrow made of uniform scraps, pointing the way north. It was a gesture of hope, a promise that they weren't being abandoned. Ripslinger and Adams, 2 friends, are left to face the end together, watching their crewmates disappear over the next dune. Now there were 3, Toner, Moore, and Lamott. They stumbled on, their world shrinking to the next step, the next breath, the next agonizing swallow of saliva that wasn't there. Wednesday, April 8th. Toner's entry is a testament to their unbreakable spirit, even as their bodies failed. Still walking north. We are all very weak. The sun is killing us. We have no water. We have not had a drink in 2 days. Pray we find water soon. They are now walking on pure will. Each step is a victory. The thought of their families, of home, of a simple glass of cold water. These are the things that keep them moving, long after their muscles have screamed for them to stop. By Thursday, April 9th, another man could go no further. Sergeant Lamott collapsed. He urged the other two to go on, to leave him. They were beyond arguing. Another man left behind. Another silent prayer whispered into the uncaring wind. Now there were two, Lieutenant Toner and Sergeant Moore, stumbling through the sand, shadows of the men they once were. They walked another 5 miles and almost superhuman feat in their condition. But it was the end of the line. Their bodies had nothing left to give. They collapsed together. This is where the diary becomes almost unbearable to read. Lying in the sand, knowing the end was near, Lieutenant Toner made his final entries. His handwriting, once so neat, is now a shaky scrawl. Still waiting for help. Still praying. Isbad lost all our weight. We are all done. The boys are with me. He's delirious. In his mind, the crew is reunited. Ripslinger, Adams, Lamott. He imagines them all there together again. His very last entry, dated Saturday, April 11th, is just a few words. No help yet, very cold night. And then silence. The pen fell from his hand. After walking an astonishing 85 miles from the crash site with almost no water, through one of the most hostile environments on Earth, the journey of the 5 men was over. They had walked farther than anyone thought possible. They had endured more than seemed humanly survivable. They had fought the desert, and with their last breath, the desert had won. Their bodies lay undisturbed, a tiny tragic monument to courage, miles from anywhere, hidden by the shifting sands. They were lost to the world, their final heroic struggle known only to the silent, watching sky. And so, in the spring of 1960, the world finally learned the fate of 5 of the Lady Be Good's crew. The diaries, flown out of the desert and painstakingly transcribed, told a story of almost superhuman endurance. They painted a picture of unimaginable suffering, but also of profound brotherhood. The entries spoke of sharing a single canteen of water among 8 men, of giving up one's own meager share for a comrade who was weaker. They spoke of navigating by the sun and stars, of holding on to hope long after any logical reason for it had vanished. The discovery brought a somber closure to 5 families who had waited 17 long years for answers. But the story was far from over. Because there weren't 5 men on the Lady Be Good. There were 9. The initial search party had found the cluster of remains where Lieutenants Hatton, Toner, Hayes and Sergeants Adams and Lamott had made their final camp. But the diaries made it clear that 3 others, Sergeant Harold Ripslinger, Sergeant Robert Waravka, and Lieutenant John Toner, had pressed on. And one man, the co-pilot Lieutenant Robert Moore, had turned back much earlier, presumably towards the crash site. 4 men were still missing, swallowed by the sands. The discovery of the diaries transformed the search. It was no longer a blind hunt across a featureless expanse. It was a race against time, guided by the words of the dead. The Army Ground Search Party, now armed with the crew's own map and timeline, focused their efforts north of the first discovery site. They knew the men were heading for the coast. They knew their approximate speed. They could calculate, with grim precision, where the remaining crewmen might have fallen. The search teams fanned out, their vehicles kicking up plumes of dust that mimicked the sandstorms that had tormented the crew. They walked the same ground, felt the same blistering sun, and stared out at the same disorienting, heat-shimmered horizon. It was a haunting task. They were following the footsteps of ghosts. Then on May 12, 1960, a search party spotted something. A small dark shape against the pale sand miles ahead. As they drew closer, the shape resolved into the form of a man. It was Sergeant Robert Waravka. He lay on his back, his hands folded peacefully over his chest. He was found 21 miles northwest of the 5-man group. 21 miles. After his companions could go no further, after watching them lie down to die, Waravka had summoned the strength to walk another full day and night, completely alone, driven by a will that simply refused to break. He had covered an astonishing 108 miles from the bailout point. He was the furthest of them all, a testament to the absolute limit of human endurance. He had walked until his body had nothing left to give, and then he simply lay down, facing the sky, and waited for the end. The discovery of Waravka was another piece of the puzzle, but it only deepened the mystery of the others. A week later, another breakthrough. On May 17th, a helicopter team from Wheelus Air Base, scouring the landscape from above, spotted another isolated figure. They landed nearby. It was Lieutenant John Toner, the navigator. His body was found 26 miles southeast of Waravka's position, in a completely different direction. This was a chilling revelation. It meant that in their final desperate hours, the last three men had separated. Perhaps they disagreed on the best route. Perhaps, delirious from dehydration, they had simply wandered apart, each man locked in his own private struggle for survival. Toner's diary had chronicled his failing eyesight. It's likely that in the end, stumbling blindly through the heat, he became separated from Reappeared and Waravka, and died alone. The discovery confirmed the heartbreaking final entry in his diary. Still no help. He had walked over 100 miles, only to perish by himself, his last hope extinguished under the vast empty sky. Now, only two men remained missing. Sergeant Guy Reappeared, the flight engineer, and Lieutenant Vernon Moore, the co-pilot. The official search continued for weeks, but the desert is an expert at keeping its secrets. The vastness of the Kalanchio Sand Sea was simply too great. Eventually, the formal search was called off. The Army concluded that the remaining two bodies had likely been buried by the shifting dunes, lost forever. For the Moore and Reappeared families, the agonizing wait continued. But the desert wasn't quite finished telling its story. Months passed. The world's attention moved on. The tale of the Lady Be Good became a legend, a ghost story whispered among pilots and oil workers. Then, in August of 1960, more than a year after the plane was first found, a British petroleum geological team was surveying a remote area about 20 miles southwest of the bomber. They were looking for oil, but they found something else entirely. They found the remains of Lieutenant Vernon Moore. His discovery was the most shocking and poignant of all. He wasn't with the others. He wasn't north of the bailout point. He was south of it. The diary had been right. Moore had been in bad shape from the beginning, his knee injured in the jump. While the other 8 men made the fateful decision to walk north, away from the plane, Moore had made a different choice. He had turned back. He must have realized, with a pilot's instinct, that their only real chance of survival lay with the aircraft. It had a radio. It had supplies. It was a massive, visible target for any search party. His comrades, perhaps disoriented or believing the coast was closer, had walked away from their only lifeline. Moore had tried to walk back to it. He had hobbled through the desert alone, his injured knee screaming with every step, heading back towards the silent, crippled bomber. And the evidence found with his body told the final, heartbreaking chapter of his story. Near his remains lay a spent flare cartridge and a flare gun. He had made it back close enough to the plane to retrieve the emergency kit. He had found the flare gun, and in a final desperate act as his life faded away, he had fired a single flare into the empty desert sky. A lone spark of hope against an indifferent universe. A signal that no one saw. His lonely death, so close to the potential salvation of the aircraft, was a brutal irony. If the crew had known their true position, if they had stayed with the plane, they would have been found within days. They had water, food, and shelter right there, inside the aluminum fuselage. But a single fatal navigational error had sent them walking in the wrong direction, on a death march into the heart of the world's largest sandbox. With Moore's discovery, only one man was left: Sergeant Guy Reappeared, the flight engineer. He had set out from the final camp with Toner and Waravka, but his body was never found with theirs. He had vanished without a trace. Where had he gone? Did he separate from the others and try a third, different route? Did he succumb to the desert somewhere between the 5-man group and the others? Or did he, against all odds, somehow make it further than anyone else before the desert claimed him? To this day, Sergeant Reappeared remains officially listed as missing, presumed dead. His final resting place is one of the last, great mysteries of the Lady Be Good. His body the only one the desert has refused to give back. The sand holds his secret still. And so, the human story of the crew had been almost completely written, etched in the sand and recorded in the pages of a small, worn diary. But the other character in this drama, the Lady Be Good herself, still sat silently in the desert, waiting. The men were gone, but their machine remained, a perfectly preserved time capsule from 1943. And investigators were about to find that the ghost ship had a few more secrets of its own to reveal. When the first U.S. Air Force recovery team arrived at the Lady Be Good in May of 1959, They weren't just stepping onto a crash site. They were stepping back in time. The desert air, dry and sterile, had acted as a perfect preservative. The bomber sat on the sand, its back broken from the belly landing, but otherwise it was eerily, impossibly intact. It was as if the crew had simply vanished moments before, leaving everything behind. The scene was so quiet, so still, it felt like a violation to even be there. Inside the cockpit, the flight logs were open. Charts were still spread across the navigator's table. In the galley, a thermos of coffee was found. When an investigator unscrewed the cap, the coffee was still liquid. It was cold, of course, but it hadn't evaporated. It was a chillingly domestic detail in a place of profound tragedy. Personal effects were scattered about. A pack of cigarettes, a leather flying helmet, a well-worn Bible resting on a bunk. It was a ghost ship in the truest sense of the word, haunted not by spirits, but by the overwhelming presence of the men who were no longer there. The investigators began a meticulous examination, treating the aircraft not just as a wreck, but as a crime scene. The central question was no longer where the crew was, but why they had abandoned a perfectly flyable airplane. The first thing they checked were the engines. The propellers for engines 1 and 2 were feathered, meaning they'd been intentionally shut down in flight, likely to conserve fuel. But the propellers for engines 3 and 4 showed clear signs of rotation on impact. This meant the Lady Be Good hadn't fallen out of the sky. It had been flown under power until the very end. It had glided gently onto the desert floor after its crew had jumped. Next, they checked the fuel tanks. The gauges were useless after the crash, so they had to manually measure what was left. The results were staggering. The Lady Be Good still had enough fuel in its tanks to have flown for another 2 hours, a distance of at least 400 miles. 400 more miles. That was more than enough to have reached their home base at Salak. It was enough to have reached friendly airfields in Malta or Sicily. The crew hadn't bailed out because they were out of fuel. So why? Why jump into the blackness of the night when their plane was still capable of carrying them to safety? The team moved on to the plane's equipment. They tested the radio. Crackled to life. Both the transmitter and receiver were in perfect working order. They could have called for help. They could have received instructions. But the flight log showed no distress calls were ever sent. It was another dead end. Another layer to the mystery. They checked the machine guns in the turrets. A sergeant pulled the charging handle on one of the .50 caliber guns, and the mechanism cycled smoothly. After 15 years of silent exposure to the desert extremes, the weapons were still functional. Everything on this plane worked. Everything, it seemed, except for the one thing that mattered most: the crew's sense of direction. And that's where the investigation finally found its answer. It lay on the navigator's table, in a device called the Automatic Direction Finder, or ADF. In the 1940s, the ADF was a pilot's best friend in bad weather or darkness. It was a simple radio compass. You would tune it to the frequency of a known radio beacon on the ground, like the one at their home base, and a needle on the instrument panel would point directly at it. All you had to do was follow the needle and it would lead you home. It was a brilliant, life-saving piece of technology, but it had one single catastrophic flaw. The needle on the ADF always points to the station, but it doesn't tell you if you are flying towards the station or if you have already passed it and are now flying away from it. Think of it like this. If the station is directly north of you, the needle points north. But if you fly over the station and continue flying north, the station is now behind you to the south. The needle, dutifully doing its job, will swing around 180 degrees and point south, back towards the station. For an experienced crew, this 180-degree ambiguity was a known issue, easily solved by taking other readings or simply turning the plane to see how the needle reacted. But the crew of the Lady Be Good was on their very first combat mission. They were green, and on the night of April 4, 1943, they were flying home in total darkness, with a thick cloud cover obscuring the stars they would normally use for navigation, and a powerful tailwind pushing them faster than they realized. The investigators pieced together the final fatal hours. The Lady Be Good, pushed by that tailwind, reached the North African coast much earlier than navigator D.P. Hayes expected. They flew directly over their home base. Through the thick clouds and the coastal fog, they saw nothing. They were expecting to see the Mediterranean Sea for at least another hour. When they didn't, they made a fatal assumption. They assumed their radios were malfunctioning and that they had been blown off course. Not that they had been pushed far ahead of schedule. So they kept flying south, deeper and deeper into the continent of Africa, believing they were still over the dark waters of the Mediterranean Sea, searching for the coast. All the while, the ADF needle in their cockpit would have been pointing steadfastly north, back towards the base they had already passed. To them, the needle was confirming their belief that the coast was still ahead of them to the north. They were following the arrow home, but they were flying in the exact opposite direction. For 2 agonizing hours they flew south. 2 hours. Into one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. They were flying away from safety at over 200 miles an hour. When their fuel calculations finally told them they should have been out of gas long ago, they must have concluded the absolute worst, that they had missed Italy entirely and were now lost somewhere over mainland Europe. The truth was infinitely worse. Finally, with their fuel running critically low, Lieutenant Hatton made the only decision he thought he had left. He put the plane on autopilot, pointed it south to avoid it crashing into them, and ordered his crew to bail out. One by one, the 9 young men jumped from their bomber, parachuting down into what they believed was the dark European countryside. They expected to land in fields, in forests, maybe even in the water. They expected to face German patrols. They had no idea they were jumping into the heart of the Libyan desert, a sea of sand hundreds of miles from the nearest living soul. As the last man jumped, the Lady Be Good flew on, its engines humming, its mission incomplete. It flew for another 16 miles, a pilotless ghost ship, until its fuel finally exhausted. It gently descended and belly-flopped onto the flat sand, sliding to a stop, where it would wait in the silence for 15 years. The plane had finally told its story. It was a story of technological limitations and a simple, tragic human error, magnified by the pressures of war and the unforgiving darkness of the night. But the story wasn't over. The investigators had figured out how the crew got lost. Now the world was about to find out what happened to them after they jumped. The answer to that question wasn't in the wreckage of the plane. It was out there in the sand in a small leather-bound diary found in the pocket of Lieutenant Robert Toner, and its first entry would send a chill down the spine of everyone who read it. Sunday, April 4, 1943. The first entry is brief, almost clinical, written with the steady hand of a man still running on adrenaline and training. It reads, "Flew to Naples, Italy. Bombed the harbor. On the way back we got lost. We flew for 2 hours, then the gas gave out. We bailed out at 2 a.m. Now we are in the desert. We are all together except for one John Waravka. We have only a half a canteen of water between us. We hope to find him tomorrow." This single entry solved the first mystery. The crew didn't crash, they bailed out. They survived the jump. And they were together, a band of brothers facing the unknown. The entry also contains the first seed of a fatal misunderstanding. They believed they were near the coast. They thought if they just walked north, they'd hit the Mediterranean. They had no idea they were 400 miles inland, deep in the heart of the Calancio Sand Sea, one of the most inhospitable places on the face of the earth. The discovery of the first 5 bodies, clustered together as if for comfort, painted a grim picture. They were found 85 miles north of the crash site. 85 miles. Let that sink in. With virtually no water, no food, and wearing flight gear completely unsuitable for the desert, they had walked 85 miles across an ocean of sand. The men were Lieutenant Hatton, the pilot, Lieutenant Hayes, the navigator, Sergeant Adams, the gunner, Lieutenant Waravka, the bombardier they had hoped to find, and Lieutenant Toner, the co-pilot, with the diary in his pocket. The diary was the key. It was their voice, reaching out across 15 years of silent sand. As the search party read on, the entries transformed from hopeful to harrowing. Monday, April 5th. All but Waravka together. A half canteen of water. 1 slice of bread for food. The sun is hot. We are walking north. Simple words, masking an unimaginable reality. They were rationing their last drops of water, their last crumbs of food, under a sun that offered no shade and no mercy. Tuesday, April 6th. Still walking north. The sun is beating down. We have no water. We are praying for help. The hope begins to fray. The reality of their situation is setting in. Every shimmering heat wave on the horizon would have looked like water. Every gust of wind would have sounded like a distant engine. But there was only silence and sand. Wednesday, April 7th. The group is getting weaker. We can't walk very far. Still praying. The entries get shorter. The energy to write, to even think, is draining away. The 85 miles they had covered was a testament to their youth and fitness, but the desert was relentless. It leeches the life from you, one drop of sweat at a time. Thursday, April 8th. Still no help. We are all very weak. The sand is endless. By now, they would be suffering from severe dehydration. Their minds would be playing tricks on them. The world would be a blurry, agonizing haze of heat and thirst. And it's on this day that the group makes a desperate, heartbreaking decision. The diary notes that 3 of the men, Sergeant Guy Shelley, Sergeant Harold Ripslinger, and Sergeant Vernon Moore, were still strong enough to continue. They would press on north alone, a final desperate gamble to find help and save their friends. The others, too weak to go on, would wait. Friday, April 9th. No sign of the boys. We are too weak to walk. The sun is terrible. I think this is the end. The 5 men who stayed behind are now facing their final hours. They knew their friends were their only hope, and that hope was now fading with the setting sun. Saturday, April 10th. The writing is barely legible. A scrawl from a man on the edge of delirium. Still no help. No water. Can't go on. And then the final entry, dated Sunday, April 11th, 1943. A single, haunting name. Ripson. It was a misspelling of Ripslinger's name. Perhaps in his final moments, Toner was thinking of his friend, the strong one, the one who had gone for help, still clinging to a sliver of hope that he would return. And then the diary falls silent. For 8 days, these men had fought against the inevitable. They had walked farther than anyone thought possible. Their bodies were found together, a final testament to the bond that held them until the very end. But the story wasn't over. The diary had given the search teams a new mission. 3 men had walked on. Shelley, Ripslinger, and Moore. They were still out there. The search grid was expanded, pushing further north, following the ghostly footprints of 3 determined men. The teams knew they were looking for a needle in a continent-sized haystack. But now they had a direction. They flew low over the endless dunes, their eyes scanning the sand for any sign, any disturbance, any clue. Days turned into weeks, and then they found him. 21 miles north of the first group, they found the remains of Sergeant Guy Shelley. 21 miles. After already walking 85 miles with the others, after his friends could go no further, Shelley had summoned the strength to walk another 21 miles alone. He had covered a total of 106 miles on less than a canteen of water. It was an act of endurance that defied belief. He had walked until his body simply gave out, a hero who died trying to save his crew. The discovery was both a tragedy and a revelation. It confirmed the diary's account and reset the boundaries of what the searchers thought was humanly possible. But it also deepened the mystery. If Shelley had made it this far, what about Ripslinger and Moore? They had left with him. Were they still out there? The search intensified. The planes flew even wider patterns, their pilots now fueled by a profound respect for the men they were looking for. They scoured the terrain mile after agonizing mile. And then another breakthrough. 5 miles north of where they found Shelley, they spotted another set of remains. It was Technical Sergeant Harold Ripslinger, the man whose name was the last word in Toner's diary. He had made it 111 miles from the crash site. He had walked farther than Shelley, pushing himself beyond all imaginable limits before finally succumbing to the desert. 2 of the 3 who went for help had been found. Their final lonely resting places told a story of unbelievable courage. But it also left 2 haunting questions hanging in the blistering desert air. The diary had mentioned another man who had gone on ahead, Sergeant Vernon Moore. He had left with Shelley and Ripslinger. Where was he? Had he somehow pushed even farther into the unforgiving wilderness? And there was another man, the 9th member of the crew, Sergeant Robert Lamotte. The diary hadn't mentioned him going ahead with the others. In fact, separate notes implied he was the first to weaken, the first to fall behind even before the main group had stopped. The search teams had now found 7 of the 9 crewmen of the Lady Be Good. The trail of the 3 who went for help had led them over 100 miles into the desert. But the desert still held its secrets. 2 men were still missing. One who may have gone farther than anyone else, and one who may have never made it very far at all. The search for the final 2 crewmen began with a renewed, desperate intensity. In May of 1960, the U.S. Army launched Operation Climax, a full-scale mission with one goal: bring every man home. Using the diaries as their guide, helicopters and ground teams methodically swept the unforgiving landscape, following the ghostly trail of footprints and artifacts left by the crew. They now knew the path of the main group. They knew that after the 5 men stopped, 3 pushed onward. And they knew from the diaries that Sergeant Vernon Moore, the plane's engineer and top turret gunner, was the strong man who kept going even after the others fell. The search parties pushed south from the spot where Rippslinger and Hatton had been found, venturing deeper into the territory that one man, and one man alone, had reached. It was an almost unimaginable feat. Moore had already walked over 100 miles with his comrades. Now he was alone, pushing his body past every conceivable limit of human endurance. For what? For a sliver of hope? For the promise he made to the men he left behind? We can never know. We only know that he kept walking. On June 12, 1960, another oil exploration team, working about 22 miles south of Rippslinger and Hatton, made the next discovery. There, lying on the sand, were the remains of Sergeant Vernon Moore. He had done it. He had walked farther than any of them, covering a staggering distance of nearly 140 miles from the point where he bailed out of the sky. It was a testament to a level of will and physical strength that is difficult to comprehend. He had walked and crawled through a waterless hell for more than a week, driven by a duty to his crew. In his pocket was his wallet, his identification, a final silent confirmation of his identity. The 8th man had been found, but that left one. Staff Sergeant Guy Shelley, the co-pilot. His name was conspicuously absent from the detailed entries in Lieutenant Toner's diary. The crew had landed together, grouped up, and started their march north. But Shelley was never with them. The searchers were faced with a chilling puzzle. If he wasn't with the main group, where could he be? The only logical conclusion was that he had become separated during the parachute jump in the darkness, a lone figure drifting down into a different part of the vast, empty desert. The search teams had to completely rethink their strategy. They were no longer following a known path. They were looking for a needle in an infinite haystack. They returned to the crash site of the Lady Be Good, the epicenter of the tragedy, and began to search outward. The working theory was that a strong wind could have carried Shelley in a different direction. In the chaos of the bailout, with no lights and no landmarks, it would have been impossible for him to know where his crewmates were, or for them to know where he was. Just a few days before the discovery of Sergeant Moore, a British petroleum survey team was working about 21 miles northwest of the Lady Be Good's crash site. It was the opposite direction from where the other 8 men had walked. There, they found the missing co-pilot. Guy Shelley had been alone from the very beginning. His parachute may have opened late, or a gust of wind may have caught him, but he landed far from the others. In the disorienting blackness, he must have chosen a direction and started walking, hoping to find salvation or his crew. Tragically, every step he took led him further away from both. He had traveled about 20 miles before he, too, succumbed to the desert. He died utterly alone, never knowing that his friends were walking in the opposite direction, just as determined as he was. With the discovery of Guy Shelley, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The full, heartbreaking story of the Lady Be Good and her 9-man crew was finally complete. A story of a simple navigational error that cascaded into one of the most remarkable and tragic survival treks in military history. If only they had known. If only, after bailing out and gathering in the dark, they had turned south instead of north. A walk of less than 16 miles, a single day, would have brought them right back to the Lady Be Good. There they would have found everything they needed. The plane's emergency water tanks were full. There were food rations. The radio, as investigators later confirmed, was still in perfect working order. They could have easily called for help. Shelter, water, food, and rescue were all within their grasp. They were so close, but they chose the wrong direction. They walked away from their salvation and deeper into their doom. A 1-in-2 choice that sealed their fate. The legacy of the Lady Be Good did not end with the discovery of her crew. The plane itself, remarkably preserved, became a legend. Parts were salvaged and used in other U.S. Air Force planes. And that's when the ghost stories began. A C-54 transport plane, outfitted with an armrest and a few instruments from the Lady Be Good, began experiencing a series of inexplicable malfunctions. Propellers that would feather without command, landing gear that refused to lower, cargo that would mysteriously shift in flight. The crew began whispering about the ghost of the Lady Be Good. believing the spirit of the lost bomber lived on in its salvaged parts. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the stories speak to the powerful aura the aircraft possessed. It was a time capsule, a tomb, and a monument all at once. Eventually, the main fuselage of the Lady Be Good was carefully recovered from the desert that had been its home for so long. Today, it rests in a place of honor at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Ohio, its sand-scoured aluminum skin telling a silent story to all who see it. And Lieutenant Toner's diary, the small book that guided searchers to his fallen comrades, is preserved as well. Its faded pencil markings are more than just a record of their last days. They are a sacred text of courage, of brotherhood, and of the unyielding refusal to give up on one another, even in the face of certain death. The story of the Lady Be Good is a profound and haunting reminder of how a single moment, a single decision, can alter the course of history for 9 lives. It's a story of young men far from home, caught in the gears of a world war, who faced their final challenge not in the flak-filled skies over Europe, but in the crushing silent emptiness of the Sahara. They weren't defeated by the enemy, they were defeated by geography, by a cruel twist of fate that led them north instead of south. But in that defeat, they left behind a legacy of almost superhuman endurance. The journey of over 100 miles on a single canteen of water is a feat that defies medical science and captures the deepest essence of the human will to survive. The desert, in its brutal indifference, took their lives, but in its strange preservative way, it also held on to their story, protecting the plane, the diary, and the final poignant evidence of their last march, waiting for the world to find it. The vast, empty desert became their final resting place, and an unintended monument to 9 men who, lost and alone, walked together into eternity.